Welcome back to the Discover podcast, where we view faith as a discovery journey with Jesus to help you become the person God created you to be. Hey there, Meadowbrook Church. Welcome back to the Discover podcast. In this episode, we're going to have a conversation with Joanna Buck, who's been a member of our church for just a couple years, talking about the theme of community and how community has helped in her faith development. Hope you find this episode to be helpful and encouraging. Well, hey there, Meadowbrook Church. Welcome back to this episode of the Discover podcast. On this episode, I have with me Dr. Joanna Buck. How about that? So, Joanna, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell our listeners, our viewers, how long you've been coming to our church, maybe how you found our church, and then just a little bit of what the makeup of your family is.
Sure. So, I'm Joanna. I am a psychiatrist. I work part-time doing adult outpatient psychiatry. And the rest of my time I'm spending with my family. I have two young kids, a 3.5-year-old and a 1-month-old. My husband and I have been attending Meadowbrook for just over 2 years now. And we landed with Meadowbrook. We're originally from the greater Milwaukee area, grew up in Brookfield, and so knew the landscape, but I was doing medical school and residency training up in Green Bay for about 7 years. And my husband, also being from the Brookfield area, we wanted to be closer to family. So we ultimately decided to move back to do that, and have been here now for about 2.5 years since I finished my training. And we, like I said, knew the landscape of the area, really wanted to land in Tosa, and we did that, and wanted to go to a church that was local, not too big. I had grown up in a larger church and had gone to larger churches for undergrad and during my medical school training. Didn't want it to be too tiny. But we landed on Meadowbrook because we thought that the messages were great.
They're fantastic.
I know.
Yeah. Fantastic.
And we really appreciated that it was approachable for all people, but that it also did not shy away from theological, deep dives.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what really led us to Meadowbrook, as well as the people, and the friendliness of the congregants.
We do have good people. Good
We
people
do.
here. Yeah. So you grew up in the Milwaukee area. It sounds like you have a church background, grew up in the church. So tell us a little bit about kind of how you initially came to faith, kind of at what point in your life that happened, and just the events surrounding that.
Right. So I grew up in a Christian family. My earliest memories revolve around church. My mom was my Sunday school leader from when I was, 3 years old. I can remember. So I remember going to Sunday school each week. We were regular attendees. And I remember one day coming home from Sunday school, and we had talked about, the salvation talk and story and the cross and the salvation gist. And I remember my mom coming home after we'd had the talk at church, and she was like, would you like to accept Jesus into your heart? And I said, no. And at that time, I felt scared. I felt put on the spot. And that really, I think, was all it was initially. But then I remember kind of running away up the stairs and sitting for a minute and reflecting on what we had talked about in Sunday school.
Was your mom your Sunday school teacher who gave you that salvation talk and then followed up with a question?
Yeah. So I don't know how that went over in her mind after, why would she say no? Right? But I remember sitting at the top of the stairs in our house and thinking, okay, mulling over what we had talked about, and, realizing, wow, my family, we all go to church, right? They're all Christians. Presumably. And if I don't accept Jesus into my heart, like we talked about, I'm not going to heaven, which means I'm not with my family. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right. So it didn't really hit me when I was young what that meant in terms of my relationship with Jesus. Now that obviously developed as I kind of grew up and got older, and came to a deeper understanding of walk with Christ. But in those early years, it didn't really mean a whole lot personally. And it was just a matter of kind of falling in step with the rest of my family and going to church the way we always did.
So you're up at the top of the stairs. Is that the same day that your mom asked you that question, like later on that day?
Exactly. Literally like 5 minutes later.
Yeah. So did you walk back downstairs and say, okay, I guess I should do this? Or did it take
I kind of
more
sat
time?
up there and was like, I think I'd rather be in heaven with my family than not in heaven, and who knows where that is.
Yeah.
Not a matter of, is that with Jesus? Is that not? Right? And I don't even think I ever told my mom after the fact. I don't remember, but I remember that conversation in my head.
Yeah. So how old, you probably were like, sounds like 5, 6, 7?
Maybe 4 or 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so somewhere along the way, maybe it's just kind of like a subconscious, like this is what I should do because I'm a part of this family, and this is what the family does. So this is what we believe, and I want to be with them forever in eternity. So yes. So where do you have like vivid moments in your story about like making conscious decisions about, okay, this is who I want to be when it comes to what I believe?
Sure. It really took me a while because of some of the difficulties I had with friendships growing up that seemed to detract from who am I, right? Because I relied a lot more on who am I with, like, who are my friends, as opposed to who am I before God, who am I before other people, weighed more heavily. It really, I went through school at a Christian school from kindergarten through 8th grade. So that I learned a lot about, and they had a very strong teaching of the Bible. And so I learned a lot just from like a content standpoint. And I think that's where I had the knowledge, right? But it didn't really settle into my heart and develop into a relationship until later middle school and more into high school and college, especially as I wrestled with some of those difficulties with friendships from those transitions, because after my middle school years, I went to a public high school. And that's where, I went from a small school to a big school.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of a shock to me in terms of then who am I? Right now I'm developing new friends. And wow, that's a challenge.
Yeah.
So it really caused me to reflect on that and wrestle with that with God. And develop a deeper understanding of who he is, but then also who am I called to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting to hear you talk about school transitions. Like my story is we moved around a lot, right? Meaning from the West Coast to the East Coast, we made a pretty significant move in those middle school years, and that's tough. I think sometimes people lose sight of in a city like Milwaukee, depending on what your like grade school, middle school, schooling is, to go to then from a private small Christian school to a public high school could be like moving across country. When it comes to your relationships, they probably drastically change if a lot of those friends don't follow. So talk about that transition and how that made a mark on you as you think about not only your identity development, but also your faith development.
Yeah. So the school that I had gone from kindergarten through 8th grade, my class size when I graduated in 8th grade was like 35 kids at most. And then I went to a class of 300, so 10 times the size. Yeah. I felt like a, little fish in a little pond went to a giant lake. And in growing up in my private school experience, I had developed, by virtue of the class size, it's pretty small. I had developed a couple close friends, one in particular, and towards the very tail end of our 8th grade year, that kind of like really started to fall apart for reasons that I didn't understand at the time, became clear later on. But essentially, I came to realize in early high school just how much I was dependent on that friend for socializing, for emotional support, all these other things. And when that really came to a head and at the tail end of 8th grade, I then felt all the more like empty-handed when I went into high school and uncertain of, well, then now how do I make this transition? So it left me with a lot of anxiety socially. And it felt like I floundered a lot socially throughout high school, and then kind of like shifted a lot of my focus into academics to compensate and also to fill the time, right? And that worked in a way because there was a lot of pressure from family to kind of, be smart, be academic. My parents were both physicians, are both physicians. And so there was actually a lot of pressure to, pursue higher academics. And so that ended up translating into, ultimately, once I went from high school to college, pursuing medical school.
Yeah. Can you think back to like that first day of walking into high school, or maybe that first week, and like, because I say this having memories of like those first days at new places and feeling like I know nobody here.
I at least knew some people because I was athletic. I played volleyball. So, that starts in the summer and you kind of your team. So there was at least some of that, but it still felt so unnatural to me because it was like this very specific context. Whereas the kids that I'd gone to school with in this private school, many of them I'd grown up with. And then all of a sudden, like, I'm meeting these people and developing, a volleyball context, but that didn't really translate to school necessarily. Yeah. And I didn't know them from years ago, right? Yeah. So it was a totally new experience for me.
Yeah. So you kind of alluded to like this breakdown of this one relationship that you had. Anything you want to say about that? Like what did you learn through, or how did that relationship change, and where did that leave you with thinking about friendships and what you do with friendships?
Right. What really, it took me years to really understand this in its entirety, but what I really came to understand was it wasn't reciprocal. I put in a lot more effort in, initiating things, conversations, getting together, things like that. But I kept coming back to this relationship out of a fear of like, well, if I don't have that friendship, well, it felt like I had nothing because it also, the fear of that kept me from developing new friendships, right? This is safe. This is comfortable. I've known this person for over half my life. Because it's still there, I don't have to, develop new friendships, especially with this big shift and transition to high school. And so I continued hanging out with that friend throughout high school. And it really wasn't until early college, where like the light bulb went on and it was like, you're investing so much more into this relationship than this person. And in having that realization, I realized just how much it was detracting from me, and that it was not actually like, I kind of called that friend out and it just kind of like fell flat. Like,
almost like, hey, I feel like I'm investing more than you are. And what does that mean?
Yeah. And it was essentially like, it felt like crickets.
Yeah. Did you guys go to college together?
We did not.
Okay. Or high school together?
Or high school.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
So, and so that was all the more investment in maintaining that on my part. And so that caused a great deal of difficulty in reflecting back on like, oh, okay, so that has impacted my high school experience. And now that has the potential to continue to impact my college experience.
Yeah.
And not just my experience, but like myself, like of who I am.
Totally.
Right? Because if I'm that dependent as I felt on that person, and not relying on God, but also not relying on the full body of believers, right? I think I'm missing out on a lot.
Yeah. So we're always looking for something external to help us understand who we are. And many times people look to, achievements or success or grades or whatever, and all of that's fair. A lot of people look to relationships as well to be their sense of identity. And I would say our true sense of identity comes from an understanding of where we belong. And sometimes people are raised in, healthy families, and that healthy family can help shape a healthy identity. If it's not a healthy family, it can do a lot of work to shape a unhealthy sense of identity. Because I think those certain relationships in our lives are always present. Like you will always be the daughter of your parents. Your kids will always be your kids. So when you have a relationship that you're looking to give you a sense of understanding of who you are, and that relationship breaks down, that can be almost like a crisis of sorts of like, okay, who am I? Whether it's a close friend, a spouse, parents, kids, whatever. So how did you find, it sounds like, okay, you moved through high school with a sense of like maybe feeling not like you didn't belong with that group in high school, whether it's volleyball or anybody else. You had this one friend, then you move on to college. And how did the breakdown of that relationship impact your college experience?
So that happened about halfway through my first year of college. So after the first semester, kind of like came home on winter break, had this, oh, we're back from winter break, get together with my friend. And that's when I was like really impressed upon me, like what was happening. And I had already been involved in the church while I was in college, and had gotten involved in a small group. And I think that happening caused me to really reflect on like, what is the nature of my like relationships with these other, it was a girls group. So with these other women, and it allowed me to open up and be more vulnerable with other people and develop those meaningful relationships that, rather than having the superficial, like, oh, let's get together and have fun and like talk and stuff, but to actually, be able to, have conversations of substance. And be real with each other.
How did that impact your faith journey?
Over the years, it has been so clear to me that in any season of life where I have been struggling significantly, there's been an absolute lack of community. Any season where I have been going through trials but have found strength and support, I've been in community. So that really started to impress upon me the meaning of family, like church family and community. And, I can look back through seasons of drought and it's clearly tied to that.
So as you've kind of narrated, okay, from, being in, before grade school all the way up until into college, the idea of like, okay, I started my faith journey because I just wanted to be with my parents in heaven someday or my family in heaven. As you kind of navigate through transition into high school, transition into college, losing friends, is there a moment in your story where you feel like, okay, this is a moment where the idea of having a relationship with Jesus became real on another level for me?
I think that really developed in middle high school. Through attendance at youth group, the youth group I was attending, which was not the youth group affiliated with my own church, but with my friend's church. But I don't even remember like distinctly. But I remember this like gradual coming to terms of, it's not just a matter of what you do. It's not just a matter of what you say or how you act. But it really is a matter of surrendering your own desires at times, oftentimes, and your own idea of like who you are, and taking on the identity of Christ, and what He has done. So that was something that came to fruition in high school.
How did that play out then because you said you went to medical school. Did you go right from undergrad into medical school?
I did not. I had a gap year.
Okay.
I had not really planned out that gap year very well. So it was kind of like pieced together. And that created a lot of stress and anxiety as well. And lack of direction. And it felt like a lot of wandering, meandering. And there was a lot of uncertainty tied into that. Naturally. But through that, God provided. He provided me with a job that I hadn't really like wanted at first. I'd actually turned down. And then it was like, nah, you really need to do this. And it ended up proving to be the like launching pad for like getting me into medical school.
What was that job?
I worked as a medical scribe. So I worked in an emergency room, helped chart for the emergency physicians. And that gave me a lot of experience to understand the role of a physician in that setting, as well as the way they think, the way they write their notes and things like that. And because of that experience, I was able to provide a kind of like supplemental application to med school. And I'm pretty sure based off of that, that's how I got accepted to medical school.
Did you apply to medical school before that gap year?
I think I applied to medical school at the tail end of... No, I applied to medical school after graduating.
Okay.
So in that fall of...
Yep.
After having graduated.
Okay, during the gap year.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah. So then from there you go to medical school, and just talk about how that transition into medical school, because if there's ever a place where you would go where there would be pressure to perform that could somehow impact your understanding of self and your identity, how did those years, I mean, we have lots of medical students here because of the medical college right down the road. And I mean, it's almost like you can see the radiating stress in a given semester or part of the year coming from these med students. It's just like how much pressure is on them to learn, to perform, to get in somewhere, to have a match or whatever. So talk about how that impacted your faith development and your sense of identity.
Sure. So, I mean, I think of a couple things when you ask me about that. So first off, I had not gotten into the medical school I had wanted to. I went to medical school in Green Bay. And I love Green Bay. But when I first was accepted to medical school there, first when I received the invitation to interview up there, I felt like Abraham. I was like, that's a foreign land. It's 2 hours away. But I felt like, and somebody who has moved around all across the country, but it felt like, Timbuktu. And it feels silly saying that now, having the perspective I do now. But that's really how it felt. And when this landed in my lap, it was clearly God's call. And I was just like, really there? Like, couldn't it be what I wanted, right? It felt like a total disappointment. So there was the stress of, moving up there and questioning, like, so there was a disappointment of not getting where I wanted to go. And so that caused me to doubt a lot of like, okay, I barely got in. So am I really good enough? Right.
Yeah.
And this was a new campus. So it was like, oh, I feel like a guinea pig. Are they really picking the cream of the crop, if you will? And I got in late. I got in, and it was essentially like 6 weeks later that we were starting. Oh, wow. And I had to move up there. I had to get an apartment, all that stuff. So it was like, okay, this is really like by the skin of my teeth, it felt like. Yeah. So there was just a lot of things that caused me to doubt myself as a medical student. But then there was also the pressure of my parents are physicians. So there was a pressure of like, okay, well, like this is just what you do. You better do it, right? No, they were never ones to be directive about what type of doctor I should be. But in my mind, I felt like I should always do something procedural, like be a surgeon or having worked in an emergency department, an emergency physician, somebody who works with their hands, since that's a lot of what many physicians do. Yeah. But over the course of, starting med school and getting into clinical rotations, I really started to doubt whether that's where I was being called. And I did feel like this, like, nebulous sense of, it's not those things that you think you should do. Yeah. Which then caused me to question, well, then who am I if I'm not going to do those things? Yeah. Especially things that actually came pretty naturally to me, and were things that I was just inherently gifted and skilled at, like working with my hands. Yeah. And so when it became fairly evident by virtue of elimination that psychiatry is actually what I was being called to, I then was really doubting and unsure because I was like, really that? Like, is that really what you're, I was tempted by virtue of my relationships and, some of the views held by even other physicians, right? That this was like a lesser medicine that I was being called to. So then it was tempting to doubt that was what I was called to because of the perception other people might have had.
So would you use the language of feeling called to psychiatry? Because sometimes people have this sense of like, oh, if you're a pastor, right, if you're a missionary, if you're doing spiritual work, you receive a calling. Well, everybody else, you just go do what you want to do.
Sure. Yeah. No, I absolutely did because and It's funny because a lot of people are like, when they're considering what they want to do for medicine, after med school and going into residency for their specialty training, you think about what you like, what you don't like, right? I actually really liked surgery. So for me, it boiled down to surgery or psychiatry, totally different things.
Yeah.
I was able to like come up with a link between them because they're really like dissecting just totally different subject matters. But, at the end of the day, they're still totally different.
Yep.
And ultimately, for a number of reasons, I certainly felt called to psychiatry. And that kind of like tied back to, not that I knew it when I was much younger, but when I was in even middle school and high school, God had really impressed upon me the verse of Isaiah 61:1 and following verses that, God has called me to bind up the brokenhearted and proclaim freedom from darkness for the captives. And I didn't.
That's what you were doing with your work.
Right, right. Within a spiritual sense, within psychiatry, though I didn't, know it a decade prior.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you're saying that verse became a sense of guidance for you well before.
Right. I even knew what that meant.
Yeah. How about that?
Yeah.
And so you've now been practicing for a couple of years out of residency,
right?
And you now find yourself in a little bit different of a season. So if we can move to like the current reality of like you're not just a doctor, but you're also now a mom, and you've got a husband, and if I got it right, you're not working full time as a psychiatrist. You still are practicing, but just not full time.
Right. Yeah, I work part time, so I split my time between two different practices. All outpatient, but I work within a health system out in Waukesha, and then I also do a small amount of private practice work in Milwaukee.
Yeah. And so now that you're in this different season of life where you finished all your training, you are working, you're in a phase of life with young kids, how would you articulate what God is doing in your life? It's clear that He led you on this path of like understanding who you are within the context of community, who you are in Him. What does it mean to have relationships and friendships that support you along the way? So what would you say you're able to identify as God's work in your life? What is He stirring in you? Where is He, inviting you to trust Him?
Yeah. Well, I have definitely been challenged to trust Him. And I mentioned earlier, we have a 3.5-year-old and a 1-month-old. So our 1-month-old son, Soren, was, we found out we were pregnant with him earlier this year. And at the usual 20-week ultrasound, when you find out the gender and make sure that, they're otherwise healthy, God willing, we found out that he was going to have likely to have a cleft lip and palate. And that was further confirmed with later, more detailed imaging and whatnot. And that left me feeling pretty brokenhearted because we had struggled for several years, almost 2 years, I should say, to get pregnant with him. No issues with our first. And it felt like all of a sudden, all this waiting, we would love him regardless, but we also knew, being from a medical background, medical family, we knew that having a cleft lip and palate would require a lot of time, investment, and like extra care. And it also just, it made me feel sad for, the difficulty that we would have, he would have, even though, of course, God's grace is that it's fixable. And so there was a lot of grief over what we were hoping for would be a normal, right? Childhood for him and for us in raising him. And in the midst of that, it became clear that, we were still called to trust God with all of that. And he has been faithful. He was born, he's been healthy. There's all of the people that have been involved in his care thus far, even a month in, and he's had, I don't even know how many appointments. But he has, he's already getting the care he needs. We've been able to get in a timely fashion. Everybody's been kind and gracious, and we've been really well supported by our community, but in our neighborhood community, our friends, our family, where it's so easy to take for granted our proximity to Children's Hospital and all the specialty care we can get here. So that's been really astounding to us.
Yeah. So through it all, is there anything that you can identify as God's grace in your life, his goodness in your life, his faithfulness in your life in this season, whether it's through your son's birth and what's happening there, or just other circumstances with your daughter, and kind of, there's so much that goes on. Sometimes we have a moment of oh, that's not what I was expecting, and the uncertainty with that, and it kind of overshadow our experience. But maybe there's other things too that you could identify.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we were in the hospital with Soren, and I was reflecting, after days of sleepless nights, right? Because I had not been sleeping well before he was born, and then he was born, and then you don't sleep, right? Don't sleep. And despite, I remember, my husband and I were in the hospital, and we had this breakdown together of because we're sleep deprived and partially, but then we're also trying to figure out how to feed and take care of this newborn child who has these needs and has to be fed differently and all sorts of things. But one of the simplest things is just our neighborhood group had given us a big gift of all the fun baby gifts, right? Yeah. But one of the gifts that literally left me crying when I opened it was a pack of special bottles, because they can't feed with normal bottles, and they can't breastfeed when they've got a cleft palate. And the thoughtfulness with that alone, that simple gift, spoke volumes. But then all the ways that we had been supported, even just in our hospital stay, with family, friends reaching out, and the gifts that they'd given us that kind of sustained us while we were in the hospital, were really meaningful, and impressed upon us. God's taking care of us. Yeah. We don't have to know the final outcome of the answers to the why us, why now, why here, why him. But God is still sovereign in the situation and providing.
It's interesting when you think back to the beginning of your story, going to high school and feeling alone and feeling by yourself, to now, as you're into adulthood, entering into a new kind of uncertain situation, but having this community around you and seeing God's faithfulness through that community. Just a strong reminder of what God does in and through his people, and the reason to be a part of a spiritual community to really support one another along the way. So. Anything else that's just turning over in your mind about, God's activity in your life? This has been a great conversation, but just to give you the final word of is there anything else out there that's if I could kind of leave this conversation naming one thing, what would that be?
In my work as a psychiatrist, I see a lot of people who are lonely, right? And I think part of this is not just the departure from faith as a society that has happened over the past decades, but also the spiritual battle we're fighting. I can't impress upon people enough in my professional work, much less within the church, how vital community is. Yeah. Right? It is literally something people live or die by. Yeah. Especially in my field. Yeah. But I think, if you're in a Christian community, but you're not plugged in to an actual smaller community, right? And group of people who know you and know what's going on and can be there for you, you're missing out on so much of the church. Yeah. And what Christ came to do for us. Because he gave himself for us, not just you, not just me, right? But for us.
For us. Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you. It's been fun getting to know you and your husband over the last couple of years. So glad that you're a part of our community, and really grateful that you would sit down and share your story with us today. So, Meadowbrook Church, thanks so much for joining in, and we'll see you next time.